Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Two Old Sexperts. I am one of your hosts, Sean McGill, shared by my colleague and co-host, Sharon Potter. Today, we're joined by Mason Luke. Mason has worked in the disability field, but is also an entrepreneur within the pleasure product business, formerly known as sex toys. Mason helps us explore and talk about how these products can be used to safely and successfully support people with disabilities as they explore their sexuality.
Really, Mason, I'm just interested in hearing your background a little bit and what brought you to a place where because Sharon told me you're supporting people clearly with sexual pleasure through products that you sell, but you also work a lot with what I'm assuming people with disabilities too.
I have two different lives. I say it that way. Like, I literally have two different identities. I have a work identity and I have a business identity. So my work identity is I work in the field of people with disabilities. I've worked for a healthcare provider for the last 13 years. That's how I've gotten to know a lot of people, such as yourselves. And I love what I do. I definitely know that I'm making a difference in people's lives. And it's primarily within the people with this intellectual disabilities, and love and care for that community so much, even though we know that it is significantly underfunded, which is a whole nother story. It's interesting because my role was not usually hands-on with people. Like, I did a lot of administrative related work. I worked with a lot of clinicians. I'm more of a data keeper. I did a lot of paperwork. I did a lot of systems management. But when I had one particular supervisor and came into the field, she was like, that's it. You're not doing your job for like the first 3 months that you're here. You're going to go out in the field. You're going to do new hire training. You're going to meet all of our direct
Yeah.
care. You're going to meet all the people that support them. You're going to meet individuals. And I want you to get to know what people do and this entire thing. So we went on a road trip for like the first 3 months. And like, she sent me all across the state so that I could see what was being done in the field. And I just loved it. And so I've always had a heart of being in group homes, and seeing people living their best lives. So that's like one aspect of my life. And then the other one was, prior to even starting in the healthcare community, I started a business selling sex toys 18 years ago. When I was in college and needed some extra money, it was joined a company that I could sell toys and make a commission. We did home parties and stuff. And for the most part, the two of those companies and like the two sides of my life never really merged until the last couple of years. And I don't really talk about my business that much at work because there's a lot of conflict there with promoting sex at work. That's what people tend to think. So I don't usually talk about it much at work, except for those that I really trust and know that they would understand what I'm talking about. So I'm definitely a pleasure advocate. Like, that's how I say it. I'm a pleasure advocate. I don't care about sex. It's all about pleasure.
I like that,
Like,
pleasure advocate.
yeah. So
Mhm.
when it came time to, and I also work a lot with the LGBT community. I'm a transgender queer man myself. So that's, my background too. I bring that to the table when I talk about things. And so everything's very inclusive when it comes to that. And so when I share different things about my life, or I share different things about my business, I'm very straight shooter. I'll tell you like it is, and I will say anatomy the way it's supposed to be said. So there's definitely clinicians who really respected that about me. Some clinicians really, they have a hard time talking about
Yes, they
sex. Like, they're
do.
great at clinical stuff,
Exactly.
but they don't talk about sex. And I'm like,
Yes.
nope. I'm not a clinician, but I will talk about sex. So we had one individual in particular, and clinicians were kind of saying how, they were struggling with, what do we do? The staff weren't sure what to do. They were having some, as Sharon would say, inappropriate behaviors, where they were like trying to make their own sex toys because they wanted to receive pleasure. And,
Yeah.
that's harmful. If you're not using the right product, creating harm, you could do
Yes.
harm to your body. And staff didn't
Yeah.
know what to do. So at one point, one of my coworkers was, Mason, this is your wheelhouse. What do we do? Like, do we buy a dildo? Like, I don't know. Do we make a staff do this? Like, I don't think our staff's going to be comfortable with it. And I was, well, I could just go do a consult with the person. I'll bring some different products there, let them touch and feel things and like see what they're into. And then, we'll make a decision based on what they like. And they were like, oh, well, that's simple. So went, met with the individual, brought a bunch of different toys, sat them on the table, explained, this is what this does, this is what that does, this is the type of sensation it creates. Here's how you use it. Here's how you clean it. And went through just it very simply. But this person was, I like this one. This one looks great. Can I get one of these? And it was very easy. Yep, you could take one of those. Here's some lube. Here's some cleaner. Here's how you store it. And then was like, okay, can I go use it now? Yep, have fun. Bye. And it was very nonchalant for me to just, have this conversation with them. And then I had a conversation after they left about, okay, now staff, what's the appropriateness? What should you be doing? What should you be watching for? And we had conversations before I came about, like private time, like what does that look like? Alone time, the cleanliness is aspect, because we wanted to create something in which we knew that this individual would, be safe. So, did all the things, and now it's sort of like this back burner idea that like occasionally if we have someone that has some sexual behaviors, we could just call Mason and he'll bring some dildos in.
Well, Mason, I mean, you could go on the road with your pleasure
Absolutely.
toy and be doing consults. You use the most important terms. You taught people how to use it, how to clean it, and how to store it. And those are the questions that I get. Well, how are you going to teach people those three things? Use, clean, store. And it sounds like you just had a very honest, straightforward conversation with people, that person that you were supporting, and they got it.
Very simply. And I even, I brought the little checklist of like, the reminders, because this person's a very visual person. Here's the checklist in case you forget, this is how you use it. This is how we clean it. So they had like, they're like, I forget how many instructions it was, like 5 instructions about like this, how you wash it, and then we spray it, and then we store it, like, and visual clues so that they knew. But that was just very person centered to know like this is something that they would benefit from.
Have you created visuals to help people? That's really awesome. I was browsing your website, Pleasure Allies, and looking on your website, you support even the trans community. I was seeing the dilators, and it hit me because I've worked with so many trans people who have intellectual disabilities, and the providers freak out. They don't want them to have surgery. And doing just what you were saying, showing them, explaining which dilator you use, how often, for how long, and creating those visuals. And I've had nothing but success with people who have followed through with it then.
Right. Yeah. It's creating the right tools for people makes things so much easier. But I think one of the other things, I'll go back to one of your previous podcasts where we talk about when people have any type of sexual desire, right? Any person can have sexual desire. These are people in adult bodies that have adult body reactions to things, right? Like there are sexual stimulants that create body natural reactions. And I think one of the podcasts kind of leaned toward, well, does that require a relationship? And to me, as I'm listening to it, I'm going, but you don't need to have a relationship to deal with your body's reaction to things. There's definitely other ways that we can deal with reactions that don't involve relationship. If we're worried about people dating, it's much easier to get a dildo or like, a masturbation sleeve than it is to find a partner. You can get one of those in 5 seconds on a website versus long term. Like now we have to find someone, now we got to date someone, then we got to wait till we're comfortable with someone. Whereas you could relieve that sensation very fast with a toy.
Sharon, you talk about it all the time. You talk about masturbation being that big happy feeling all over.
Orgasm, the big happy feeling all over.
And you talk about the benefits of an orgasm too.
Absolutely. Yep.
Lots of medical benefits.
Absolutely. And most of the people that we support are not going to have lifelong partners. That's the reality, unfortunately. I think about so many times when staff will call and they say, well, we don't know what to do. And it's such a simple thing to do. Get something. I mean, people are harming themselves. And, well, we didn't know we could do that. And, well, if you don't do it, they could die, literally, in some cases.
When you look at the website, there's something for everyone. Sharon and I talk so much about the horror stories, and you hate doing that, but that's what gets people to listen, though, too. It's why else do people watch the news? It's all horror stories. And very little is something good, but it pulls people in. And when I was browsing your website, I thought, my gosh, there's something for everyone. And remembering this one consult that I did, this person was putting hooks from the Christmas ornaments into his penis, creating a lot of damage to the urethra. And that's not an uncommon thing, but just teaching people about different sex products, sex toys like the sounding rod, could
Yep.
have diverted everything that he went through too.
Yeah, I tend to hear more stories about people inserting things into their anus that then don't come out because they're not the right products and they don't have flared bases.
That's
And then
right.
what happens? You end up in the ER.
And people are laughing, and it's just, I overheard someone that was a nurse, and she was telling her family about, she thought it was so funny. This person came in and, I mean, didn't mention their name, but there was nothing funny about it.
Yeah.
And I just had to say, I hate to spoil all this laughter, but there's nothing funny about this at all. That person could have died or become, been really injured in some way. And because they're not comfortable enough to get or have access to something, it's not laughable.
But that's very typical even of, neurotypical people too.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
they don't have access to the information, they don't have the comfortability with products that the majority of people going into the ER aren't people with intellectual disabilities. It's neurotypical people
Yeah,
who
yeah.
are, doing the same thing.
This was a
Yeah.
neurotypical person that came from a very evangelical conservative family and was told never ever, these are things you never do. You'll go to hell if you do. And it's just outrageous to me that we in this country with we use sex to sell everything, and we
Mhm.
can't talk about the nitty-gritty healthy benefits of being sexual.
That's an interesting point. America is really good at using sex to sell everything from cars
Oh
to
my,
hamburgers. You see it.
absolutely.
But America is so hung up on talking about sex. So why are people still feeling the need to hide, to not try to get the information, to talk openly about, hey, I use this, that, and the other, and it brings me great pleasure? Why are we
Right.
still such freaks about that sort of thing, do you think?
I would say it depends on the community in which it's being talked about. So I would say it's way more prevalent in the LGBTQ plus community to talk about sex, to talk about sex toys, to talk about pleasure openly, honestly, without laughing. Like, there's a lot of different reasons why, but I think that there's just so much more open communication because there's so much less judgment.
Yeah.
But I would say it's the heterosexual community in particular that's more, they're more laughing about it and they're more conservative about it. But from all of my years of experience in selling toys, it tends to be those people that tend to buy the freakiest things, ironically. When I used to go do home parties, we'd have a party with like 20 women, and there was always one in the crowd that, of course, has to laugh about the butt plug. No one wants the butt plugs because these are funny. And then as soon as we go in the ordering room, she's like, "Yeah, I'd like that 5 set, thanks." Like, so,
Yeah.
and after a while, I started using that sort of as an opening when I was talking. So I'd be like, "Listen, whoever is the one that's talking about all the kinky things and the butt plugs is probably the one that's buying them. So just so you know, if it starts, just know that's who it is." And it really
Yeah.
quaboshed like a lot of that inappropriate conversation, though. And now people weren't laughing at it because they were like, "Oh, people are going to think it's me."
Yeah. I have an Australian friend, and she said to me once, thank God we got the criminals and you got the Puritans. It's true. We're just so hung up. I don't even know who we are anymore, because our inability to talk about it is just so unnatural. It's damaging. And
My experience is at least very different. I like to push envelopes with people and I talk about sex all the time.
good for you. Yeah. I mean, friends my age, 81, if they say, what do you do? I mean, after 5 minutes, they're like, oh my God. How did you get to do that? Well, because it needs to be done because nobody else is doing it. I mean, you guys are doing it, but look how few people. I mean, Sean
Yeah.
and I often talk about, there are wonderful providers all over the state, all over the country, but certainly in Pennsylvania as well. But the bottom line is the biggest problem with sexuality and supporting people with disabilities is us, the
Hmm.
professionals. And, we've just got to continue and really, really push in a positive way, not a judgmental way, and do another statewide training, see if we can do something that's broader and deeper, help people who want to do the right thing, but just aren't comfortable doing it.
Mason, do you have a way? I mean, what's your approach in trying to help people get a little comfortable when they're clearly uncomfortable talking about some of these pleasure toys and objects that can be used? Do you have an approach to that, or just use humor and still just be direct too?
I'm pretty direct. I do use humor. It's funny. There was an article written about me just last year. I had gone to a college and done something called condom bingo. And so it was like 300 kids, and we were playing bingo. And instead of using numbers on your bingo card, it was pleasure products, it was different types of lubricant, and it was all like different things related to sex. And so every time we would call a number, I would talk about like, okay, this is, like let's say it was a dildo, right? I'd talk about different types of dildos, what the different uses are. So we did it educationally every time we called a number. And, people then came up because they would win prizes. And, I'd present them with a dildo, a butt plug, whatever the different thing was. And the article that was written about this particular event was from a perspective of a student who was really uncomfortable with the idea, but a friend brought her there. And she goes, it was so amazing that in, just a few minutes of being in the room and, getting this education, it was so fun that you didn't feel like you were necessarily like learning. And then, amazingly, people were coming up on stage winning prizes, and it just normalized people getting handed dildos. People got sex toys for prizes, and it became normalized. So I don't know. Humor is definitely good. I think just normalizing it and making it part of conversation when it makes sense. Obviously, don't make people uncomfortable on purpose, but I think that there's definitely approaches that can definitely help. And condom bingo apparently was one of them. We also did some we called it Dick Olympics. Like so we had a tie for bingo. You had to like toss a ring onto a dildo, like, ring toss, but it was like a cock ring and dildo. So it was fun.
It was
I
fun.
think adding fun to things just makes sense.
We need to
Yeah.
expose people to things.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, if you have a lot of people that are all kind of joining together for the same purpose, I think it also works too. So it's hard to say whether or not rolling this out in a public forum among disability providers would work the same way. But
Erin Potter, she can do it. She can run the Dick Olympics and everyone will be fine.
I would absolutely do it. But I
Yeah.
still need a tutorial, I have to say. But and that's exactly what I would be getting. I was thinking about the times that I've had training sessions for staff, and one of the things I do is break people down into small groups of 4 or 5 and ask them to answer 2 questions. And one is, what messages did you get about sex as a child? Well, within a minute, you heard laughter coming from the groups because the messages were ridiculous. And then the second one is, how did you learn the truth about sex? And it's, a book, of the talk class, a friend, or in some cases, it's because they were abused or exposed to sex in a traumatic way. But it gets people on one hand laughing, another one really thinking deeper about it.
Well, Mason, I think you're a good bit younger than me too, I'm gonna guess. But I mean, I remember just even through the AIDS crisis. I mean, that's exactly what it
Yeah.
was. My graduate work, I worked at the Pittsburgh AIDS Task Force, and just the fear on people's faces, or the disgust perhaps, in giving out condoms. What that was like 25 years ago. And I sit on a board for a health community center now too, and we do the same thing. We hand out things like condoms, and I feel like that's getting better. That response is better, but it's still, people are just still very uncomfortable
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
I think again, it goes back to what community it's in, though. Like for us, at least locally, we have multiple. Like obviously we have the LGBT center that Sharon originally started in this area, but there's also 3 different gay bars like around the same block. So if people need condoms, they always know that like you can go to like any one of the gay bars, and like one of the healthcare companies is sponsoring condoms at the bar. So I don't know. Like to me, there is definitely more okayness with, a normalization around, there's free condoms in the bar, go get a drink, pick up some condoms in case you take someone home.
We're not here to talk philosophy, but I always sit and a million things run through my head. Being a part of the LGBT plus community, I wonder, because we are just so like, hey, it doesn't matter, we'll talk about just anything. Does that sort of propel other people to think that we're more into sex? And you were talking about, we're so open and talking about it, we're okay and saying, this gives me pleasure, this doesn't, I'd like to try this. I just feel there's such a stereotype on people in the LGBT community that we're these sexual perverts. And I always joke, I have yet to meet a trans person who's raped someone in the bathroom. I haven't come across that,
God.
but I come
Right.
across rapists every day that I'm asked to do, screenings on or something. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that whole thing?
I would say, at least from those that I've had the conversations with, there's a lot of jealousy in heterosexual communities that people don't talk openly. They
Hmm.
don't want to be the first ones to say something, but as soon as the conversation allows them in it and they can talk about things openly, they will. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's definitely just a comfortableness though. Like, because I've definitely had, like I said, when I did home parties, it was easy 20 women over the age of, we'll say 30, who openly talked about sex as soon as at least one person starts breaking down the barrier. And I think it helps those smaller groups, as opposed to a public setting, with people that you don't know.
Mhm.
But I've definitely seen a lot of openness come from starting conversations. And that's probably things that I'm exposed to because of the line of business that I'm in. But outside of that, I would say no, there's definitely still a lot of stigma around that.
You're really doing a public service, though. Seriously.
Absolutely. I'm so impressed. I've said this in another podcast, but it always makes me laugh. A year or so ago, I got together with three friends, and we're all around the same age, late 70s, 80. And they were asking about the podcast. And we were talking about masturbation. And in the middle of our conversation, the grandchild and partner of one of the women came in to see her grandmother. We were in the grandmother's house. And they came in and said, "What are you guys talking about?" And somebody said, "Ask her." Me and I said, "We're talking about masturbation." They look like they were going to fall right over. And these were young people, college kids, but
Yeah.
but then they just laugh. It's so uncomfortable for people. And yet if you can break through that, it's like Niagara Falls. I mean, people will ask all kinds of questions and tell you things. Yeah.
Definitely. I think that's one of the that's a key that I didn't say before is permission. Permission to ask questions and
Mhm.
permission to be curious are definitely two really big components that I embrace with people. I'll say customers especially, it might start with one question and usually someone will say, "I have a question for you." And I'm like, "Okay, go ahead." And they'll be like, "Well, this is a little uncomfortable," or they'll usually use some verbiage that makes them believe that this is something that's unique to them, or that they're the only person that's experienced this. And once they like tell me what the thing is, I'm like, "Listen," or like they start with that, and I'll usually say, "Listen, there's almost nothing I have not heard of before. Like, I have heard the gamut. You would not believe some of the things I've heard." But whatever it is, I pretty much probably heard it, if not to the person right before you asked. So usually that helped break down some like stigma even for themselves.
Yeah.
And after they ask their questions, I'm like, "Oh yeah, like that's one of like the number one questions that I'm asked. This is normal. Like most people have this question." And then like that kind of helps them feel a little bit more at ease that they're not
Yeah.
alone in whatever it is that they're questioning or want to experiment with. And it does help then, okay, well, now I have another question for you. And I'm like, go ahead, like ask whatever you need to, like, or want to, if you're curious, let's keep going with this. And then sometimes asking some questions back to them. Well, have you thought about this? Kind of posing some things back, I think, has also helped. But maintaining that curiosity and the ability to ask questions freely without judgment is definitely a key to breaking down barriers.
Definitely a way to help people feel safe and secure, and
Yeah.
begin
Yeah.
to explore some of it too, which is really, it's important. I was thinking too, we talk a lot about intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, but people with physical disabilities,
Oh,
cerebral
Yeah.
yeah.
palsy or spinal cord injuries, how
Absolutely.
these toys, these sexual pleasure toys, can really be a game changer for people who have physical disabilities too. Have you had any experience in that area?
Yes and no. So I tend to get the inquiries about them, and it depends on the physical disability in particular. I can definitely like recommend certain products for certain disabilities, or I'll say physical disabilities that I know a lot about. If people have, let's say, a lot of older women in particular, they may struggle with holding things for a long period of time, arthritis in the hands, things like that. So there's definitely different products that I can recommend that, may or not put strain on your hand. Might be hands-free options, things to that nature. Someone, let's say, doesn't have mobility in any of their hands, right? That gets a little bit trickier to be able to say, okay, like you may require assistance to start a device, but then after that, you might be okay. Or if you have, I'm trying to think of like some different ones, like there's a lot of different like app-based toys that sometimes you can actually use if you are a vocal person. You can tell like Alexa to do things. There's different things like that we can come up with that may or may not work for someone based on their own physical limitations. But a lot of times it takes a lot more investigatoriness and curiosity to say, okay, well, what can you do? What can't you do? What can we, maybe adapt that would work for you? I would say the ones that have very limited mobility in hands, though, is the hardest to come up with suggestions for, or may require at least another person to turn on a device, turn off a device. And that gets into some other questionable, like, can a staff assist with this? Can they not assist with this? Do they agree to this? Is this part of their job description? Are they getting paid to do this?
You turn on the
Yeah.
lights, don't you? So turn on the
Yeah.
vibrator.
Yeah, it's different. Well, what if they have to touch a body part and does it cross a barrier at some point? I'm like, well, you change
Yes,
people regularly. Like, is there
Right.
that much of a
exactly.
difference between changing someone and assisting them to turn on a device for them? Like, I don't see a huge difference in that, but I'm also very open to sexuality and stuff and don't necessarily think that like because you helped someone initiate their own sexual pleasure that you become a part of that. But a lot of people who have some reservations about sex would definitely be like, I'm not touching someone else's penis, because, that's not something that I do, or that's not something I'm comfortable with. I think there is definitely some questionableness in there. There's some debates on whether or not someone should or shouldn't do certain activities. But in my opinion, if that's something that you're really not comfortable with, let's try to find some like a staff member that is comfortable with it.
It's
Because
comfortable.
if not, I don't think that especially, people that need the assistance are going to feel comfortable either.
Right, right.
So why would we have a staff assist with something that they don't really want to have interaction with and then make it worse for, people that need the assistance?
I once had a mother call me, and she said every time he needed to have his his diaper change and clean, and he would get erections, and they didn't know what to do about it, and they had an aide, and it was so uncomfortable. And I said, well, he's aroused. I said, how old is he? And I think he was 17. I said, well, of
That's
course,
normal.
yeah. And then I said, does he masturbate? And she said, I don't want to hearing it. I think she was ready to pass out. But I said, can he be positioned? I mean, is his manual dexterity good enough that he can? And if it is, can you position him in a way, pillows or whatever, and leave him alone and he does what he's going to do? And she started to cry. And I thought, oh my God. She said, in 17 years, no one has ever talked to us about sex, ever. And I said, well, give it a try. And she called back like a couple of weeks later and said that his dad and she would position him, and he was fine. He was very happy, in fact. But it could have gone on forever, forever. I
Yeah.
mean, they just
And I imagine from like that person's point of view, the person that may or may not have been able to do it on their own before, sexual frustration is a thing too. So if
yeah,
you are constantly, having arousal and never have satisfaction, that also can lead to other uncomfortableness.
absolutely. Yeah.
Aggression can spike,
Yeah.
depression can flare. I mean, it can get ugly for
Yeah.
people. They cannot find that release. And, when you were talking about the app devices too, I have to reveal my secret shame. I've been watching 90 Day Fiance, and they had an episode where they were talking about these overseas couples, and the partner can control the sex toy through the app to give their partner pleasure. And
Hmm.
they were talking about how that was really a game saver to their relationship, because we do all these online tests to see what kind of person we are and what we need in a relationship. That physical connection is a huge component for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
in our field, we really limit people to even get together where they're freaking out. We don't want them to have sex. And I thought, well, man, something like that could even be used if you have a real couple, right? Not just somebody you met at the day program who's your boyfriend, but you're dating and you just don't, staff don't get you here, they don't get you there, and you want to engage in some type of physical connection. That could be it.
Yeah, I would say
Exactly.
I've seen some really good success for like app-based things for two different sets of populations. One is long distance relationship because that just makes sense. But then other ones, actually, one that you might not really think about is trauma. Folks that have had a lot of trauma, sexual trauma. So they might respond really well to a toy. They might respond really well to engaging with a person, but they don't like physical touch of another being.
Hmm.
And it's a great way to bring intimacy together from a person to another person via a device instead of body to body contact. So you don't necessarily engage in some like trauma trigger responses
Yeah.
by separating body to body, but still being able to have intimacy.
It's really interesting.
Exactly.
That's an interesting,
Yeah,
but it makes perfect sense. I just never really
absolutely.
considered that. And that is another area, the trauma piece is where I see a lot of providers pumping the brakes. I have one person that I see, he has a girlfriend in a group home, and her team was really pumping the brakes. Like we did sexual consent screening on him. We armed him with condoms. We did everything. He was ready to go, but they just really focused on her history of trauma. She had been raped. Well, he had also. And so you talk through it and you still
Yeah.
proceed and looking at, one, does the person want to engage? Two, do they have the skills, knowledge, and information to
Right.
proceed in a safe way? And if the answer is yes, we can't use that as a reason to continue to stop people from
Yeah.
engaging.
Yeah, I worked with a couple that he had a horrendous history of trauma, and they were very serious. They wanted to have alone time, and they both were able to give consent, but he didn't know about her trauma. He didn't know about her history. So I asked her for permission when we met. I was meeting with both of them to discuss the whole history. And she said yes, and we did. And he said, I would never hurt you. And so we got to the point where I said, of course not. We know that. But her body, you could touch her in a certain way in a certain part of her body, and her body's going to remember that.
Right.
And it could be really upsetting. But if we talk about it and process it before, then it's a whole other thing. He's going to be more careful with her, and she, and they ended up getting married, so it was all really wonderful. But yeah, I mean, you just don't know. I mean, we've had people that will nail somebody because they touch them on the shoulder. Well, they say it was for no reason. Well, no, there's a reason. You just haven't dug deep enough. So the
Yeah,
trauma is
the body has some natural responses.
absolutely.
This is a part of your life. Any advice or recommendations that you might have for people who are listening and they're thinking, I might want to explore this more, either for myself, for someone I support, or someone that I love?
I would say consultation is a great starting place as opposed to just jumping in like head first. I think there's definitely sex therapists out there, there's pleasure experts out there, there's all kinds of different folks that work in this community really well. And having conversations sometimes about what might be triggers, what might be pleasure, what consent looks like for you. And, I'd say if there's a partner component outside of pleasure, what that looks like, and incorporating those together to see what might be a great route to be able to start exploration versus just diving in head first. Because there's definitely people that go to buy their first toy, spend $200 on a toy, and they're like, I don't like that, and then that ruins them for toys in the future, right? They're like, I don't want
Yeah.
anything ever because I tried it once and it was horrible. And I also say, stay curious is another big one. Like just because you tried one thing doesn't mean it. I always say like foods, right? You might try a food one time and you didn't like it, but then you try it a different way or with a different spice, it might change your taste a little bit. Sex is very similar, pleasure is very similar. Try new things, try it more than once. You might have just had an off day. Medications play a lot into what
Yeah, yeah.
people's bodies' responses do as well. So there may or may not be better products for you based on what's going on. Always add lubricant. make sure it's the appropriate type for you. Staying curious is the biggest one, though.
Sharon, you have a
Well,
big smile on your face. I love it.
yeah, you're an absolute treasure. I'm so glad that we found you. It's very exciting. It really is. I just think about so many people, and you feel like Sisyphus, like pushing the rock up the hill over and over and over. And people mean well, but they're uncomfortable and they don't want their person to get hurt. And I mean, all the things, and I think the consultation part that you mentioned is enormous. I mean, just to be able to say, what are your concerns? Or, ask questions, ask me anything, tell me anything, and I'll walk you through it.
Or I would flood you with business. I typically, when I write reports, put a link right in the report. I would like to start sending people to your website, but do you do consultations? So if I have someone in Pittsburgh or Virginia or somewhere that they need just a little more advice or consultation, is that something that you can do?
Yep. For folks that are long distance, Zoom works pretty well for for long distance purposes. If I find that there's someone that really could use some hands-on work with, maybe we should touch and feel things for the first time, like I might be able to make arrangements for like either myself or someone that's local to them that does similar work to be able to do that, or at least be able to give them some guidance of like, here's a local store that you can go to. Here are the questions to ask so you can touch and feel the right things in the store, and make sure that that store also has the right, like, demos and testers available. I do know most stores nowadays across more than the country, I'd say, because of being in this business. They're not really my competitors, but I work with a lot of other companies as well. So that's helpful. And then, if there's certain brands or products that I have the availability to chat with from a manufacturing perspective, I can get to know a lot of their products too. One thing I will add that's unique is because I work specifically with like the trans population, that's a little bit different. And if you think about products in general, a lot of them are marketed toward men or women, right? Like there's not very much in between. So that's changing in this field right now as far as like pleasure products. And I'm working with many of them to help create more inclusive products that are designed for different body types. So I've started that work with trans folks in mind to start. And I'm seeing at least a slight uptick in products that are created for people with different, I'll say, physical disabilities, that might have, more unique needs as far as, like if they can't hold things, or, maybe don't have, ambulation. So I think that that's also a wave that we're going to see a change in the future too, is that products become a little bit more inclusive of different needs. So if we find that anywhere along the way that like, a product doesn't work for someone, or there isn't a product that exists, I at least have an in with manufacturers to say, you should create this product.
That's really interesting.
That's awesome. That is
Yeah.
awesome.
I'm working with a couple different brands right now to create new products specifically for the trans masculine community.
Hope is on the horizon. Mason, I really appreciate you taking the time and carving out an hour today to chat with us and meet with us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
To find out more about the products that Mason sells, you can visit his website, Pleasure Allies, at www.pleasureallies.com. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.